I never thought I'd be sharing something like this, but I need to get it off my chest. My name's Alex, I'm 36, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 8 years. Up until a few months ago, I thought we had a solid, happy marriage. Sure, we had our share of disagreements like any couple, but I never doubted her loyalty or the strength of our bond. That trust feels like a distant memory now. This story isn't just about Emily, it's also about my best friend, Chris. Chris and I have been inseparable since college. He's the kind of guy who could make anyone laugh, even on their worst day. About 5 years ago, though, Chris's life changed forever. A car accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. It was a devastating blow, not just for him, but for everyone close to him. After the accident, I made a promise to myself: I'd always be there for Chris. He was family to me, the brother I never had. Emily felt the same way. She was incredibly supportive, going out of her way to make sure Chris didn't feel isolated. Together, we became his support system, checking in on him regularly, helping him with errands, and just being there when he needed someone to talk to. At first, I was proud of Emily's compassion. She had such a big heart, always wanting to help others. She'd offer to visit Chris when I couldn't, especially during busy work weeks. "He needs someone, Alex," she'd say. "I just want to make sure he's okay." It made sense, and I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? Chris was my best friend, and Emily was my wife. But looking back now, I can see the cracks that were forming even then. It's funny how hindsight works, how you can look back and see all the little things you missed, all the signs that something wasn't quite right. At the time, though, I didn't think much of it. I chalked it all up to Emily's natural kindness and Chris's difficult situation. It started out as small, seemingly harmless things. Emily began spending more time with Chris than I did. She'd go over to his place after work, sometimes staying late into the evening. She said he was lonely, and honestly, I believed her. He didn't have much of a social circle anymore, and it made sense that he'd appreciate the company. But then, things began to shift. Emily started dressing up more before heading over to Chris's place, not in a flashy way, but enough that I noticed. She'd wear makeup or put on nicer clothes, which wasn't her usual routine for casual visits. When I teased her about it, she laughed and said, "Come on, Alex, I can't look like a slob all the time." I wanted to believe there was nothing to worry about, that her behavior was normal. But as the weeks went on, that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger. Late nights at Chris's house became more frequent. She'd come home looking tired and flustered, brushing off my questions with vague answers like, "It was a long day," or, "We were just talking about life." At the time, I told myself not to overthink it. Emily was my wife, and Chris was my best friend. What could possibly be going on that wasn't innocent? I trusted them both completely. But trust has a funny way of crumbling when the pieces start falling into place. In the next part, I'll explain how those little signs began to add up and the moment I realized I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong anymore. Looking back, it's almost embarrassing how much I ignored at first. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. Emily was kind and compassionate, and Chris was my best friend, a guy I trusted with everything. But as the weeks went on, the little signs that something was off became harder to brush aside. The first thing I noticed was how much more time Emily was spending at Chris's place. At first, it made sense. She'd say things like, "He's having a tough day," or, "He needs help reorganizing his kitchen." I trusted her judgment, so I didn't question it. But then the visits became longer, more frequent, and less about helping with practical things. One evening, she came home later than usual. I asked her what had taken so long, and she gave me a vague response. "Oh, we just ended up watching a movie. You know how it is, time flies when you're catching up." She smiled, but something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Then there was the way she started putting more effort into her appearance before heading over to Chris's. She began wearing makeup more often, choosing outfits that were a little nicer than what she'd usually wear for casual errands. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a laugh, saying, I just don't want to look like a mess all the time. Besides, Chris deserves to have company that doesn't look like a slob. I told myself not to overreact. Emily had always cared about how she presented herself, and Chris was our friend. Why would I suspect anything else? But there was something in the back of my mind, a small, persistent voice, that wouldn't let it go. Then came the late-night texts. I'd catch her on her phone before bed, smiling at the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd shrug and say, "Just my sister," or, "It's the group chat from work." Again, I wanted to believe her. There was no reason not to. But then, one night, something strange happened. I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner when Emily's phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen out of reflex and saw a message from Chris. "Chris, you're amazing. I don't know what I'd do without you." My stomach dropped. It wasn't necessarily incriminating on its own, but paired with everything else, the long visits, the late nights, the change in her behavior, it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't want to jump to conclusions without knowing more. But the uneasy feeling in my gut was stronger than ever. In the next part, I'll explain how my suspicions grew and the moment I decided to dig deeper into what was really going on. After seeing that text from Chris, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Emily acted like everything was normal, smiling and chatting with me like she always did, but I couldn't stop replaying the message in my head. "You're amazing. I don't know what I'd do without you." I tried to tell myself it was innocent, that Chris was just expressing gratitude for all the help Emily had given him. But the longer I thought about it, the more it didn't sit right. Why didn't he send those kinds of texts to me? I'd been there for him just as much as she had, yet his messages to me were always straightforward and friendly. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Emily's behavior. She'd become more secretive with her phone, angling the screen away from me or quickly locking it when I walked into the room. When I asked about it, she'd laugh and say, "Oh, just work stuff. Boring emails." She also started making excuses to spend even more time at Chris's place. "He's struggling to keep up with things," she'd say, or, "He's been feeling really down lately, and I don't want to leave him alone." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was something about the way she said it, like she was trying to convince me, or maybe herself, that it was the right thing to do. One evening, she came home late again. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere. When she walked in, she looked flustered, her hair slightly out of place, and her cheeks flushed. "Tough day?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She nodded quickly, avoiding my eyes. "Yeah, Chris just needed to vent about some things. It's been hard for him lately." I wanted to ask more, but I held back. Something told me she wouldn't give me a straight answer. That night, while Emily was in the shower, I noticed her tablet on the coffee table. It was synced with her phone, and a part of me, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to check it. I hesitated, debating whether I was overreacting, but that nagging voice in my head wouldn't let it go. When I finally opened it, my heart sank. There, in the messaging app she used with Chris, were texts that went far beyond friendly. They started innocently enough, jokes, updates on his day, but as I scrolled further, the tone changed. "Chris, last night was incredible. You don't know how much it means to me. Emily, you deserve to feel loved, Chris. You've been through so much, and I'm just glad I can be there for you." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was reading. These weren't just two friends leaning on each other, they were having an emotional affair at the very least. The more I read, the worse it got. "Chris, I feel guilty about Alex. He's been such a good friend, and I hate lying to him. Emily, I know, but this is about us. He wouldn't understand what we have." I couldn't read any more. I locked the tablet and sat there in stunned silence, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. How could this be happening? My wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone, and my best friend, betraying me together. In the next part, I'll explain how I confronted Emily, and the shocking way she tried to justify her actions. The morning after I found those texts, I woke up feeling like a different person. The trust I'd always had in Emily, and Chris, was shattered. My mind raced with anger, hurt, and confusion, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep this to myself. Emily was in the kitchen, making coffee like it was just another normal day. She smiled at me as I walked in, completely unaware of what I'd discovered the night before. "Morning," she said brightly. "Sleep okay?" I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed her tablet from the living room, placed it on the kitchen counter, and slid it toward her. "What's this?" I asked, my voice cold. She looked down at the tablet, and I saw her expression change in an instant. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Alex, Don't," I interrupted. "Don't try to explain it away. I saw the texts, Emily. All of them." She stood there frozen, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment I thought she might deny it, but instead, she let out a shaky breath and said, "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." "Find out what, exactly?" I said, my voice rising. "That you've been sneaking around with Chris? My best friend? That you've been lying to me for months?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't sure if they were from guilt or because she'd been caught. "It's not what you think," she said quickly. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You've been having an affair, Emily. What's so complicated about that?" She hesitated, then whispered, "It wasn't an affair. Not really. I felt sorry for him, Alex. He's been through so much, and he needed someone to be there for him." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her justification. "You felt sorry for him? So your solution was to betray me? To betray our marriage?" Her tears started falling then. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It started with me just helping him out, trying to make him feel less alone. But then, it just got deeper. He made me feel needed in a way I haven't felt in so long." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Needed?" I said, my voice shaking. "I've always been there for you, Emily. Always. But instead of talking to me, instead of working on us, you chose him?" She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "Alex, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never stopped loving you." I laughed bitterly. "You have a funny way of showing it." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Finally I said, "I need some time to think. Don't expect me to forgive this any time soon." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there in tears. But I wasn't done yet. I knew the next step had to be confronting Chris. In the next part, I'll explain how that confrontation unfolded and the shocking revelations that came from it. Spoiler: it didn't go how I expected. After confronting Emily, I couldn't stop thinking about Chris. My best friend, the person I trusted with everything, had betrayed me just as much as she had. I knew I couldn't move forward without hearing what he had to say, even if it ended with more pain. The next day, I drove to Chris's place without telling Emily. She had tried to talk to me that morning, but I wasn't ready to hear her excuses again. This time, I needed to face Chris directly. When I arrived, Chris looked surprised to see me. He was sitting in his wheelchair by the window and wheeled himself to the door as I approached. "Hey, Alex," he said, trying to sound casual, but there was a nervous edge in his voice. "What's up?" I didn't waste any time. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Chris wheeled back, his expression shifting to concern. "Is everything okay?" I shut the door behind me and turned to face him. "No, Chris, everything's not okay. I know about you and Emily. I saw the texts." His face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Alex, I don't know what to say. How about the truth?" I snapped, my voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this to me, Chris? I trusted you. You're supposed to be my best friend. He looked down, avoiding my gaze. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered. That's the same crap, Emily said. I shot back. You didn't mean for it to happen? What does that even mean? Did you trip and fall into this? You made a choice, Chris. Both of you did. He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with guilt. It started with her just helping me out, you know? After the accident, I felt like less of a person. Emily, she made me feel like I mattered again. I know it was wrong, Alex. I hate that it happened, but I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't know how to stop it? I said, my voice rising. You could have said no, Chris. You could have told her to back off, or better yet, told me what was going on. But instead, you went along with it. You lied to me. You both did. He reached out as if to grab my arm, but I pulled away. Alex, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. You're like a brother to me. I laughed bitterly. You don't hurt someone like this if you see them as a brother. You've destroyed everything, Chris. I can't trust you anymore. I can't even look at you the same way. The room fell silent, the weight of everything hanging between us. Chris's eyes welled up with tears, and he said, I don't expect you to forgive me. I hope one day you can understand that I wasn't trying to take something from you. I was just trying to feel whole again. I shook my head, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. You didn't just take something from me, Chris. You took everything, my trust, my marriage, my belief in you as a friend. I turned and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before leaving. We're done, Chris. Don't contact me again. As I drove away, a mix of emotions churned inside me. Part of me felt relieved to have confronted him, but another part felt even more broken. The two people I cared about most had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. In the next part, I'll explain the fallout from both confrontations and the steps I took to start reclaiming my life. Spoiler, it wasn't easy, but it was the beginning of something better. After confronting both Emily and Chris, the fallout hit like a wrecking ball. My marriage, my closest friendship, everything I had thought was solid, was crumbling before my eyes. I wasn't prepared for how messy things would get. Emily tried to salvage the situation. Over the next few days, she oscillated between pleading for forgiveness and blaming me for what happened. You've been so distant lately, she said during one of her attempts to explain. I didn't know how to reach you anymore, and Chris, he was there for me. I stared at her, stunned by her audacity. So it's my fault now? I pushed you into having an affair with my best friend? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. That's not what I'm saying. No, I interrupted, my voice firm. That's exactly what you're saying. You could have come to me, Emily. We could have worked through whatever issues you thought we had. But instead, you chose to betray me. Every conversation with her ended the same way, her crying, me shutting down, and the weight of her betrayal growing heavier. I moved into the guest bedroom that week, unable to even sleep in the same bed with her anymore. Chris, meanwhile, tried reaching out a few more times. He sent me long-winded texts apologizing, saying things like, I never meant for it to happen. And, I hope one day we can talk this through. I ignored every single one. As far as I was concerned, there was nothing left to say. Word eventually got out to some of our mutual friends. I hadn't planned on telling anyone, but Emily and Chris's behavior must have raised suspicions. Some friends reached out to express their shock and support, while others, surprisingly, tried to stay neutral. One friend, Sarah, said something that stuck with me. I just think it's a shame. Everyone makes mistakes, Alex. Maybe you should hear Emily out. I couldn't believe it. A mistake? I said bitterly. This wasn't one moment of bad judgment. They lied to me for months. They planned this. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. It became clear that some people would never fully understand what I was going through, and I decided to distance myself from those who couldn't support me without judgment. The hardest part was realizing how much my life had revolved around Emily and Chris. They were central to everything, our friends, our routines, our plans for the future. Without them, I felt adrift, unsure of where to even begin rebuilding. That's when my friend Matt stepped in. Matt had always been a straight shooter, and when I told him what had happened, his reaction was immediate and fiery. "Dude, they're both garbage," he said bluntly. "You deserve so much better than this. Don't let them drag you down any further." Matt became my rock during those early days, checking in regularly and helping me navigate the emotional and logistical mess of separating my life from Emily's. He even came over one weekend to help me pack up her things. "Get rid of the dead weight," he said, tossing one of Emily's old sweaters into a box. "You're starting fresh, man." As painful as it was, he was right. Packing up her things and setting boundaries with her was the first step toward reclaiming my life. In the next part, I'll explain how I began taking control of my situation, legally, emotionally, and financially, and the steps I took to start moving forward. After the initial shock and emotional chaos, I realized I couldn't keep living in limbo. My marriage was broken, my friendship with Chris was over, and I had to start focusing on myself. The first step was taking back control, legally, financially, and emotionally. I called a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was necessary. Emily's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it had seeped into every corner of our lives. We had a joint lease, shared finances, and a house full of memories I couldn't bear to live with anymore. The lawyer was sympathetic but straightforward. "Start gathering evidence," she told me. "Texts, financial records, anything that shows infidelity or misuse of funds. It'll help if this goes to court." Going through the evidence was painful. Revisiting the texts between Emily and Chris felt like reopening a wound that was still fresh, but I knew it was necessary. I took screenshots, documented timelines, and organized everything into a folder. Next, I opened a new bank account in my name only. I transferred my share of our savings into it, leaving just enough in the joint account for immediate expenses. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting myself. I also changed the passwords on all my personal accounts and removed Emily's access to anything she could misuse. When Emily found out about the new account, she confronted me. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Because I can't trust you anymore," I said simply. "You lied to me, Emily. You made this mess, and I'm not going to let you keep dragging me down with it." She tried to argue, but I walked away. I was done letting her control the narrative. Emotionally, the journey was harder. The nights were the worst, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my head. I kept wondering where things had gone wrong, whether I could have prevented this, whether I'd been blind to signs that had always been there. That's when I decided to start therapy. A friend recommended someone they trusted, and while I was skeptical at first, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. My therapist helped me understand that Emily and Chris's actions weren't about me, they were about them. Their choices reflected their own flaws and insecurities, not my worth as a husband or a friend. She also helped me process the grief. "You're mourning the life you thought you had," she said during one session. "That's normal. But it doesn't mean you can't build something better moving forward." Around this time, I started reconnecting with old hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage. I took up running again, joined a local gym, and even signed up for a hiking group. Being active helped clear my mind and reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart. The support from true friends like Matt also kept me grounded. He'd show up with beers and pizza, ready to distract me with bad action movies or long talks about anything other than Emily and Chris. "You're not alone in this, man," he said one night. "We've got your back." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. In the next part, I'll share how I began to find a sense of peace and stability in my new life and how an unexpected encounter forced me to face Emily one last time. As I started to piece my life back together, Emily's presence in my world began to fade. She had stopped trying to convince me to work things out. After I moved into the guest room and started making legal preparations, I think she realized I was serious about leaving. But one day, she asked to talk, one final conversation, as she put it. Part of me didn't want to hear anything she had to say, but another part felt like I needed closure. So I agreed. We sat at the kitchen table, the air thick with tension. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her hands. I just want to say my piece, she started, her voice trembling. I nodded, crossing my arms. Go ahead. She took a deep breath. I know I hurt you, Alex. I know I broke your trust, and I hate myself for it. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to lose you. I stayed silent, letting her continue. I wasn't thinking clearly, she said, her voice breaking. Chris was going through so much, and I thought I was helping him. I thought I was doing the right thing, but somewhere along the way, I got lost. I made terrible choices, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life. I stared at her, trying to process her words. Part of me wanted to believe she was being sincere, but another part knew it didn't matter anymore. You didn't just hurt me, I said finally. You destroyed everything we built together. You didn't even give me a chance to fix whatever you thought was broken. You went to him instead of coming to me. That's a choice you made, Emily. Over and over again. She wiped away a tear, nodding. I know. And I'm sorry. I hope one day you can forgive me. I let out a bitter laugh. Forgive you? Maybe someday, but not for you. For me. So I can move on without this anger hanging over me. But forgiving you doesn't mean I'll forget, or that I'll ever trust you again. She flinched at my words, and for a moment I thought she might argue. But instead, she nodded again. I understand, she said softly. I'll pack my things. That was the last meaningful conversation we had. Over the next week, she slowly moved out, taking her belongings and leaving behind the life we'd shared. Watching her go was bittersweet. Part of me felt relief, but another part mourned the life I thought we'd had. When she closed the door for the last time, it felt like a chapter of my life had ended. In the next part, I'll talk about how I embraced the freedom of starting over, and the unexpected joys I found in building a new life for myself. After Emily walked out of the door for the last time, the silence in the house was deafening. It was strange, seeing the empty spaces where her things used to be, the gaps in the closet, the barren shelves. But for the first time in what felt like forever, that silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like freedom. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The routines I'd built around Emily and our marriage were gone, leaving me with a blank slate. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. The first thing I did was tackle the house. I rearranged furniture, bought new decor, and replaced the things that reminded me of her. I wanted to create a space that felt like mine, a reflection of who I was now, not who I'd been when we were together. Then I turned my attention to myself. For years, I'd let my hobbies and passions fall by the wayside, focusing instead on work, my marriage, and helping Chris. Now, I had the time and energy to rediscover those parts of myself. I started running again, something I'd given up after Chris's accident. At first, it was tough, both physically and emotionally. The trail I used to run with Chris was full of memories, and the first few times I went back, I felt a pang of sadness. But as the weeks went on, running became a form of therapy. It cleared my mind and gave me a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in a long time. I also joined a local hiking group. It was a way to meet new people and push myself out of my comfort zone. One of the group members, a woman named Rachel, quickly became a friend. She had a warm, no-nonsense attitude that I found refreshing, and we bonded over our shared love of the outdoors. Rachel's friendship came at a time when I needed it most. She didn't pry into my past or push me to talk about what had happened, but she offered quiet support that helped me feel less alone. At work, I threw myself into my projects, earning recognition and eventually a promotion. It felt good to be appreciated and to have something tangible to focus on. The biggest shift, though, was internal. Through therapy, running, and reconnecting with myself, I started to let go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. I realized that holding on to those feelings only gave Emily and Chris power over me. I didn't want to live in their shadow anymore. One evening, after a long hike with Rachel and the group, we sat at a viewpoint overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting everything in a warm, golden light. "It's funny," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. "A few months ago, I thought my life was over. But now, I don't know. I feel like I'm finally starting to find myself again." Rachel smiled, nodding. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives push us towards something better. It doesn't erase the pain, but it makes the journey worth it." She was right. In the next part, I'll share how my growing friendship with Rachel and the lessons I'd learned from my past helped me embrace a new chapter in my life. As time went on, my friendship with Rachel became one of the most important parts of my life. She was everything I hadn't realized I needed: honest, grounded, and completely drama-free. There was no pressure, no games, just a natural, easy connection. At first, we kept things strictly friendly. I wasn't looking for a relationship, and Rachel had her own past to work through. She'd been in a toxic relationship that ended about a year before we met, so she understood the emotional weight I was carrying. We spent more time together outside the hiking group, grabbing coffee, going for runs, and even just sitting and talking about life. She never pushed me to open up, but she had this way of asking the right questions at the right time. One evening, as we walked along the trail after a run, Rachel turned to me and said, "Do you ever feel like you're finally starting to breathe again?" I paused, thinking about her question. "Yeah," I admitted. "For a long time, I felt like I was drowning in everything that happened. But now, it's like I'm finally coming up for air. It's not perfect, but it's better." She nodded, a soft smile on her face. "It shows. You seem lighter than when I first met you." That moment stuck with me. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to thrive. As our friendship deepened, I began to notice things about Rachel that I hadn't allowed myself to see before. The way she laughed, her curiosity about the world, her unwavering sense of self. She wasn't like Emily in any way, and that was part of what drew me to her. One night, after a particularly long hike, we sat by a campfire with the group. The stars were out, and the conversation had lulled into a comfortable silence. Rachel leaned over and asked quietly, "Have you thought about what's next for you?" "Next?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said. "You've been through so much, and it feels like you're finally moving forward. What do you want your life to look like now?" I thought about her question for a long moment. "I want peace," I said finally. "I want to build something meaningful, something honest and real. No more lies, no more drama." Rachel smiled, her eyes meeting mine. "That's a good goal." Something shifted between us that night. It wasn't rushed or dramatic, but it was there, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, we could be more than friends someday. In the next part, I'll talk about how Rachel and I navigated the delicate balance of friendship and something more, and how her presence helped me truly embrace my new life. After that night by the campfire, I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel. There was something about her, something calm, steady, and genuine, that made me feel at ease. But I was hesitant to take the next step. I wasn't sure if I was ready for another relationship, and I didn't want to risk ruining the friendship we built. Rachel didn't push, and that's what I appreciated most about her. She gave me the space to figure out my feelings without any pressure. We kept spending time together, more hikes, more coffee runs, and more long conversations about life. One afternoon, we met at a park for a casual run. Afterward, we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, sipping water and cooling down. "You've been quiet today," Rachel said, glancing at me. "Just thinking," I admitted. "About what?" I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "About how different things are now. A few months ago, I felt like my entire life was falling apart. But now, I don't know, things feel better. Lighter." She smiled. "You've come a long way, Alex. You should be proud of yourself." I looked at her, my chest tightening in a way that felt unfamiliar but good. I couldn't have done it without you, I said softly. Rachel's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her hands. I didn't do much, she said. You did more than you think, I replied. You've been there when I needed someone, without asking for anything in return. That means more than I can say. The air between us shifted in that moment. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, it was subtle, like a door quietly opening. A few weeks later, I decided to take a chance. I invited Rachel over for dinner, something we hadn't done before. It wasn't part of the hiking group or a casual meetup. It was just the two of us, and I made it clear it was something more than friendly. When she arrived, she gave me a warm smile that made my nerves settle instantly. We talked, laughed, and shared a meal, and by the end of the night, I knew I wanted to explore whatever this was with her. As I walked her to the door, I paused. Rachel, I need to say something. Okay, she said, her voice soft. I don't know where this will go, but I want to see what happens. You're amazing, and I feel like we have something special here. I don't want to let fear hold me back. Rachel smiled, her eyes lighting up. I've been waiting for you to say that. That was the beginning of something new, something honest, real, and entirely different from what I'd experienced before. In the next part, I'll share how my relationship with Rachel grew and how it helped me fully embrace the idea of moving forward without the shadow of my past. Rachel and I officially started dating after that night. It wasn't rushed or overwhelming. It was slow and steady, just like her. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe in a relationship. There was no drama, no walking on eggshells, no fear of betrayal. Being with Rachel was a completely different experience from my marriage to Emily. Rachel valued honesty and communication above all else. If something bothered her, she brought it up. If I needed space, she understood. We were both careful, knowing that we'd each been hurt in the past, but instead of letting that baggage weigh us down, we worked through it together. One night, while we were sitting on my couch watching a movie, she turned to me and said, I know you're still healing, and I want you to know that I'm okay with that. This doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. Those words hit me hard. For so long, I'd been trying to fix myself, to become whole, before letting anyone in. But Rachel wasn't asking for perfection, she was asking for honesty. As our relationship grew, I realized how much I'd learned from my past. With Emily, I'd ignored red flags, avoided difficult conversations, and let things fester because I didn't want to rock the boat. With Rachel, I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistakes. One day, while we were hiking, she asked, Do you think you've forgiven Emily and Chris? The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. I'm not angry anymore, but I don't think I'll ever fully forgive them. What they did was unforgivable in a lot of ways. But I've accepted it, and I've moved on. Rachel nodded. That's fair. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means you're not letting it control you anymore. She was right. I didn't feel the same weight of anger and betrayal that I'd carried in those first few months. Emily and Chris were part of my past, but they no longer held power over my present or my future. Rachel became more than just someone I was dating, she became my partner in every sense of the word. She encouraged me to push myself, to chase the goals I'd set aside during my marriage, and to embrace the person I was becoming. In the next part, I'll talk about how my relationship with Rachel helped me rediscover my purpose and the final steps I took to fully leave my past behind. As my relationship with Rachel grew, so did my sense of self. For the first time in years, I felt free to focus on what truly mattered to me. Rachel didn't just support me, she inspired me to rediscover the dreams and goals I'd abandoned during the chaos of my marriage. One of the biggest changes was at work. With Rachel's encouragement, I started taking on more challenging projects and pitching ideas that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. My efforts didn't go unnoticed, and within a few months, I was offered a leadership position. You've always been capable of this, Rachel said when I told her the news. You just needed to believe in yourself again. Her belief in me pushed me to believe in myself, and that confidence carried over into other areas of my life. I started running races again, something I hadn't done since before Chris's accident. Crossing the finish line of my first half marathon felt like a symbolic victory, a reminder that I could overcome challenges and keep moving forward. Rachel was there, cheering me on from the sidelines. When I crossed the finish line, she wrapped me in a hug and said, "You're unstoppable, Alex. Don't forget that." Beyond work and running, I found myself reconnecting with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I'd let many relationships drift while trying to juggle everything with Emily and Chris, but now, I had the time and energy to rebuild those connections. One night, over drinks with my friend Matt, he said, "You're like a completely different person now. It's good to see you happy again." "I feel different," I admitted. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm living my life for me." That realization was powerful. I'd spent so much of my marriage trying to meet Emily's needs, fix problems I didn't create, and ignore the red flags that eventually tore us apart. Now I was free to build a life that felt authentic and fulfilling. But as much progress as I'd made, there was still one last thing I needed to do to fully move on, face my past head-on. In the next part, I'll share how an unexpected encounter with Chris forced me to confront the lingering pain and find true closure. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, months after Emily had left, and I'd started my new life with Rachel. I was at a coffee shop, enjoying some downtime with a book, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Alex?" I turned and saw Chris. He looked different, older, more tired. His hair was a bit thinner, and there was a heaviness in his expression that hadn't been there before. For a moment, I considered ignoring him, but something in his face stopped me. "Chris," I said, my voice flat. "What do you want?" He wheeled closer, his hands gripping the sides of his chair nervously. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. I wanted to talk." I stared at him, debating whether I even wanted to hear what he had to say. But a part of me, perhaps for closure, nodded. "Fine. Talk." Chris hesitated before speaking. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to apologize. For everything. For betraying you, for lying to you, for ruining our friendship." I said nothing, letting him continue. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "After everything fell apart with Emily, I realized how much damage I caused. I lost you, and I lost myself in the process." Hearing him mention Emily surprised me. "What happened with her?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. He sighed. "It didn't last. Whatever we thought we had wasn't real. She left a few months after you did, and I haven't heard from her since. It was all a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake." I leaned back in my chair studying him. He looked genuinely remorseful, but the damage he'd done couldn't be undone. "You hurt me more than anyone ever has," I said finally. "You didn't just betray our friendship, you shattered my trust in you and in everything I thought we had." Chris nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I just hope, maybe one day you can forgive me." I looked at him, searching for the anger and bitterness I used to feel when I thought about him. But it wasn't there anymore. Therapy time and my relationship with Rachel had helped me let go of those emotions. "I don't hate you, Chris," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I've moved on, and I don't want you in my life anymore." Chris looked devastated, but he nodded. "I understand. I hope you're happy now, Alex. You deserve it." "I am," I said simply, standing up. "Take care of yourself, Chris." I left the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in months. Seeing Chris and hearing his apology gave me the closure I didn't realize I needed. For the first time, I felt truly free from the weight of his and Emily's betrayal. In the next part, I'll share how I fully embraced my new life with Rachel and the lessons I learned from everything I'd been through. Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt like I'd finally closed the book on that chapter of my life. Confronting Chris one last time had given me the closure I didn't even know I needed. I wasn't carrying the weight of his betrayal anymore. For the first time, I felt completely at peace with where I was and where I was headed. Rachel and I celebrated our one-year anniversary a few weeks later. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a quiet dinner at home, the way we both liked it. As we sat at the table, laughing and reminiscing about the past year, I realized how far I'd come. You know, I said, setting my glass down, a year ago, I didn't think I'd ever be happy again. I felt like everything I'd built had been taken away. Rachel reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. And now? Now I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, I said. She smiled, her eyes warm. You've built something incredible, Alex. And I'm so glad I get to be a part of it. Her words meant more to me than I could say. Rachel had been my anchor, my safe harbor in a storm I thought would never end. She didn't just help me rebuild my life, she helped me believe in love and trust again. As I sat there, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the painful process of letting go. It had been one of the hardest experiences of my life, but it had also taught me some of the most important lessons. Trust your instincts. The gut feeling I'd ignored about Emily and Chris had been right all along. Prioritize yourself. I'd spent too much time sacrificing my happiness for others, and it had left me drained and vulnerable. Forgiveness is for you, not them. Letting go of my anger toward Emily and Chris had freed me to move forward without their shadows hanging over me. Life can be better after loss. What felt like the end of the world had turned out to be the beginning of something far better than I could have imagined. As Rachel and I cleaned up after dinner, she wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "You're stronger than you know, Alex. And you deserve every bit of happiness that's coming your way." She was right. Life didn't end when Emily and Chris betrayed me. It began again. And while the road had been rocky, it had led me to a place of peace, love, and purpose. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that even the worst moments in life can lead to something beautiful if you let them. The pain doesn't last forever, and on the other side of it, there's light, growth, and hope. Here's to new beginnings and the strength to embrace them.